Good evening, and welcome to all present here in the church, to those viewing in the infirmary and other parts of the campus, and to those friends and relatives of Mary Fran joining us on Zoom. Let us pray. Oh God, we gather in your presence in the depth of the mystery that is you, to remember Sister Mary Fran and to ponder once again the endless cycle of birth and death. We give you thanks for her presence among us and for the life of service that she lived. Welcome her now into the fullness of your presence. We ask this in the name of Jesus, your Son. Amen. We will now hear Mary Fran's biography, prepared by Eleanor Craig, archivist.
Mary Frances Lottis was born into what she described as a secure and happy life in a large family during the Depression years. She was the fourth child of Arthur and Roberta Lottis, with Helen, Arthur, and Richard before her, and Marge, Paul, and Robert after her. Her father was born in St. Mary, Missouri, not far from Loretto's earliest Missouri mission. Her mother was Roberta Murray from Moberly, where Loretto's had taught since 1877. Mary Fran herself attended St. Rose Parochial School in St. Louis, a Loretto school, and won a scholarship to Loretto's High School, Nearinks Hall, from which she graduated in 1941 after 4 very happy years. She went on to Webster College, but after her first year, her brother Art, who had been working in their father's office, went off to the war. Their father asked Mary Fran to leave college and take her brother's place at the office. And she said, I was glad to do it. 4 years later, at the end of the war, Mary Fran wrote to Mother Edwarda, requesting admission to the Loretto novitiate. In her July 1945 letter, she wrote, when I told Dad of my plans to become a nun, he asked me not to leave until Art returned, which may be possible this coming fall. I want, more than anything else, to do God's will. One of the purposes of this letter is to convince myself that I am not delaying unnecessarily. I have had recent, frequent doubts as to whether I could serve God best in a teaching order or not. I have decided I would still like to mail this to you as a sort of an anchor. Later, she wrote, I'm still praying for divine guidance, though now I feel pretty certain that it is in Loretto that God wants me. I have placed the matter entirely in his hands, and I know that when the time comes, there won't be any doubt. Mary Fran arrived at Loretto February the 15th, 1946, with other Webster students, including Rosalie Brennan, Sister Mary Roger, and Ann Rita Willard, Sister Ann Madeline. They were received on August the 15th, and Mary Fran became Sister Margaret Mary, a name she used only 5 years. In 1951, as a gift to her father, she asked to return to her baptismal name and was Sister Mary Frances Lottis for the rest of her life. After her first vows, August the 15th, 1948, Mary Fran was sent to Holy Family Grade School in Denver. 3 years later, she and Mary Ken Lewis helped to open St. Joseph's School in Rawlins, Wyoming, in what she called, quote, a broadening and challenging experience. She was at Rawlins only 2 years when, quote, I went from teaching primary grades, which I had grown to love, to teaching high school Latin and religion, a 4-year assignment at St. Mary's in Englewood, Colorado. During these years, Mary Fran completed her undergraduate degree in English at Loretto Heights College. In 1957, Mary Fran and Ann White, Sister Ann Richard, took a boat to Europe and enrolled at Regina Mundi Pontifical Institute in Rome, a newly established graduate program for women religious. Mary Fran wrote wonderfully descriptive letters to Reverend Mother Eduarda and then to Reverend Mother Luke about her coursework and extracurricular education in Italy and on a visit to the Holy Land. While in Rome, she and Ann White were present for the election of Pope John the and for his coronation. Both returned to the States in 1960 with a magisterium in Scientiae Sacris, a master's degree in theology. She was sent to Webster College to teach theology. In 1963-64, she also served as Dean of Students. Over the next 2 decades, Mary Fran would study scripture, process theology, feminist theology, liberation theology, and ecumenism, all fields inspired by the renewal of the Vatican II era. Another great broadening, Mary Fran said, occurred when she was elected to the General Council of the congregation in 1964 and served for 6 years in Mary Luke Tobin's second term. Mary Fran called this, quote, a time of great changes, as her duties involved her in directing the change of habit to every Loretto house. She admitted later that she suffered meeting the opposition and the suffering of others. At the same time, this was a great time of personal integration, she said, and a growing love for Loretto and for nature. During and after her time on the council, Mary Fran also taught at Bellarmine College and in the permanent diaconate program, both in Louisville Archdiocese. She served on the liturgical commission and was a full-time consultant for parish workshops, also in Louisville. From 1978 to 82, she served as coordinator of life development in Marion McAvoy's administration and continued into Marion's second term in various roles. Mary Fran loved, quote, growing young with the novices with whom I worked. That was during the 1960s in the traditional novitiate and in the 70s when the novitiate was much more individualized. Her personnel file contains a number of scholarly essays and papers which she prepared for Loretto about our heritage, our spiritual development, and the constitutions and canon law. On a resume prepared for a job application at St. Paul's School of Theology in Kansas City in 1986, Mary Fran wrote, quote, I am qualified to teach in the following areas: liberation theology, feminist theology, Christology, and liturgy. In addition to teaching at St. Thomas Seminary in Denver, each year I give many lectures, discussion sessions, workshops in liberation theology to study groups, adult church groups of Methodists, Lutherans, Roman Catholics, Presbyterians, and groups of Catholic sisters. That's unquote. Mary Fran was appointed visiting lecturer for 1 year at St. Paul's, then moved on to Santa Fe, where following a year of study and reflection, she joined Sylvia Cedillo, Penny McMillan, Pauline Alban, and others in founding and staffing the Women's Spiritual Center. This was Mary Fran's final full-time work from 1989 to 1994, a work that combined in the most organic way her knowledge and experience of theology, adult religious education, women's spiritual development, and one-on-one counseling. After 1994, Mary Fran described herself as, quote, doing freelance retreat work and spiritual guidance from a base at Loretto Mother House. She did basic education and counseling at the women's prison near the Mother House. Mary Fran and Mary Swain maintained residence on the second floor of the novitiate building, offering warm hospitality to visitors and to Mother House residents alike. This account of Mary Fran Lottis' scholarly training and professional work fails to evoke the warmth and compassion that shone in her eyes, sounded in her soft voice, and lit her face with an ever-present, welcoming smile. But this remembrance does help us appreciate how far beyond Loretto many have been enriched, encouraged, and inspired by our Sister Mary Fran's gifts. This may help her family, the nieces and nephews, to know Mary Fran as a woman of wide and deep-reaching influence. And it certainly helps us all to see, in practical terms, the fruits of Mary Fran's deepest desire. More than anything else, I want to do God's will. Divine guidance, into whose hands Mary Fran placed each of her 74 years as a Sister of Loretto, has made blessedly clear that she was indeed intended for Loretto and Loretto for her.
In 1993, Sister Jean Kelly wrote the poem Soulscape for Mary Fran. For those watching on their TVs, you will see Jean reading the poem. Those of us in the church will get to listen. Technical difficulties. We're having some technical difficulties getting this up. Just tell them that.
Susan just said the screen share was disconnected, and so they're having to connect. I think we're fine just waiting, aren't we?
Soulscape for Mary Fran. I would paint it, I think, in watercolor. Bright reds and yellows and blues. Your house, with its pot of brilliant summer flowers, against the terracotta of the old adobe. Here, in this ancient hillside house, I find my scattered questions solved. For life is earth-based, splashed with color. I would place my easel on the cobblestones outside the open kitchen door, where century-old vigas line the pure white plaster ceiling. My eyes would follow uneven flagstone steps up to the desert garden, now above my head. I would mix a series of graduated greens to color aloes, century plants, and other xerophytes. I would sketch a wooden chair at the garden's edge where you sit to ponder the foliage and life and love and ecstasy.
It just seems we need a moment or two with Jean's poem. And then to hear from Paul. Love is patient, love is kind. Love is not jealous. It does not put on airs, and it is not snobbish. It is never rude or self-seeking. It is not prone to anger, nor does it brood over injuries. Love doesn't rejoice in what is wrong, but rejoices in the truth. There is no limit to love's forbearance, to its trust, its hope, its power to endure. Love never fails. Prophecies will cease, tongues will be silent, knowledge will pass away. Our knowledge is imperfect and our prophecy is imperfect. There are, in the end, three things that last: faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love.
Psalm 16 has been adapted as being read through Mary Fran. Preserve me, God. I take refuge in you.
I said to the Lord, "You are my God. My happiness lies in you. You have put into my heart a marvelous love. for the faithful ones who dwell in your land. I will bless you, God. You gave me counsel. Even at night, you directed my heart. And so my heart rejoices. My soul is glad. Even my body rests in safety. Apple of life, the fullness of joy in your presence. At your right hand is happiness forever.
Let us pray. We affirm that the greatest asset of the community is the life of every member. Therefore, we lift up in prayer our Sister Mary Fran, to whom you showed mercy and compassion, fullness of joy in your presence, and now happiness in your embrace forever. Welcome Mary Fran into your presence and into the company of her family members and all Loretto saints who have preceded her in death. We ask this in the name of your Son, Jesus. May the God of holiness bless and keep us. Amen. May the God of tenderness smile upon us. Amen. May the God of truth bring peace to everyone. Amen. We will need a short time to reposition the microphone for the sharing of memories. We will begin with sharing from those here in the church, and then Nicole will call on those who are wishing to speak, who are watching on Zoom.
Oh, it's wonderful to hear all those things that Mary Fran has been doing. And the one thing that I had kind of remembered was that she was a little ahead, like she was teaching at Bellarmine, teaching theology at Bellarmine back in the 60s and early 70s. And then a priest was there, and so they wanted the priest to teach. So she lost her job because the priest had to teach. And then in the liturgy office, she did liturgy work in the diocese for years, but she never could be head of the office because it had to be a priest. Well, for 20 years at least, it's been a woman has been heading up the office, different ones. And Mary Fran never was angry about that, the gentleness that you spoke of. But I kept thinking there were those things that she kind of was leading the path or providing a path for people coming after her. Sylvia Cedillo wanted to say something, but of course she can't do that. She talked about Mary Fran at the Women's Spiritual Center in Santa Fe, that she was on the board, that she gave retreats. She was a spiritual counselor for people. And it just was a special time for many people there.
Your name.
Nancy Whitwer. My two memories of Mary Fran that I share with you are from the distant past. In 1989, Mary Ann McGivern encouraged me to leave my classroom at Narings Hall for 1 week to participate in a delegation traveling to El Salvador. That experience changed my life in many ways. The deep faith of the very poor who met weekly to share their reflection on the Sunday gospel led me upon my return to contact Mary Fran, who at that time was, I believe, on the General Council. We worked together to sponsor a summer retreat at Nobbs Haven and brought Megan McKenna to lead us. The outcome was the formation of gospel groups among Lorettos who faithfully gathered to reflect on the weekly gospel. I know that a few of those groups are still active here at Loretto Mother House. That could not have happened without Mary Fran's leadership and her deep spirituality. Another memory of Mary Fran during her time on the General Council is when she was given the onerous task of converting us to exchange our religious habits for a Hanmacher suit. Some of you remember what a huge and thankless undertaking that was. But Mary Fran, in her kind and gentle way, suffered through what was, on occasion, abuse and unwillingness to cooperate. You all know the end of the saga. Mary Fran, our wise, kind, and gentle warrior, won our hearts and our habits. You have changed our Loretto life, Mary Fran, in many ways, and we are so very grateful.
Mary Kay Brannon. I must admit that Mary Fran was my spiritual director for a long time. We went to learn how to be, to be certified as directors in Baltimore at Shalem, which was most interesting. And I met her at the House of Studies, and she was just so willing to be herself with anybody. And so I grew a lot, particularly in some of the theology that she taught, some of the love of Jesus that she lived. I also lived in New Mexico, not with her, but we were in Taos and she was in Santa Fe. And we often had great times going. And I remember a ski trip that she liked to, she skied cross country, right? And so we went, my one and only time with her, and she took a very, very steep place. And but we just always had very good times, and she came up often to Taos to visit, and we were often went to Santa Fe, and would always, particularly at Christmas time, share everything together, and birthdays and all of that. The reading in Corinthians, for me, is who Mary Fran was. She was a great listener. And when you were talking to her, those eyes of hers never left your face. And she could probably say anything back to you what you had said. So she was just always, she also, uh, when I was living at the mother house, and she happened to be also living in the mother house, she helped me at a time in a very, very difficult time. And I will never forget her for that.
Mary Fran and I met for the first time in 1960 at the St. Louis House of Studies. We had both been assigned there. Neither of us had ever been a superior, and yet here we were to be in charge of all these younger sisters. I had just finished graduate school, and Mary Fran had just returned from Rome. So at that time in St. Louis, we lived in the old wing of the brick House of Studies and in the White House. And the chapel was in the White House. So about the first night we were there, the first night Mary Fran came, she came about a week later. She said after night prayers, I think I'll just stay here for a little while and pray. And I, as a naive young superior, said to her, I'm sorry, sister, you can't stay in this building by yourself at night. She who had traveled all over Europe by herself, come across the ocean, could not stay in the White House next door. She took it gently, went back to the other building. But I'd just like to say, without Mary Fran, I never could have survived. She was a help in all ways in running the house and keeping it, and at the same time, teaching at Webster College. So my great tribute to Mary Fran.
Alicia Ramirez. When I was living in Nicaragua, it was time for the Maryknoll sisters to make a retreat, and they were coming from El Salvador and Guatemala and Panama and Nicaragua. And there were about 30 of us. And for some reason, the person who was supposed to give the retreat was not available. So I said, I know someone in my community who's really good and I think she would do it. So they said, well, go for it. So I wrote to Mary Fran and asked if she could come and do the retreat. And the Maryknollers always did the retreat at a beach near Leon. And so everything was arranged, and we did sessions with Mary Fran. Then we would go swim and play in the beach and come back in our swimsuits and have a little chat. So it was just wonderful to have her there, and they loved her. Another time when I was living in Las Vegas, Nevada, with Sister Lorraine Treese, we were talking about making a retreat, and I told her that Mary Fran had given us a wonderful retreat in Nicaragua. So she said, well, let's see if she'll come. So she did. We called her and she did come, and we made a retreat again in our swimsuits at my brother's swimming pool there. She was so genuinely interested in people. One night when we were sitting at a kitchen table at my sister's house, my mother was sitting there, and Mary Fran engaged her in conversation and began to ask her about how she came and the circumstances, how she came to the United States as a little girl. And my mother just opened up, telling her things I had never heard. And it just really touched me so much that Mary Fran could bring this
out of my mother. So I was always indebted to her. And after that, I made sure I did a little interview with my mother on tape. So it was just wonderful of her to open up my mom.
Denise Ann, I remember being at the House of Studies with Antoinette and Mary Fran, and both of them, I must say, were perfect ladies. And they had a lot of work to do because we had a lot of refinement to learn. And I do remember the gentle way, Antoinette didn't correct me too much, but I did have quite a few confrontations with Sister Mary Frances, and she was very gentle in her, she told me how wonderful I was, but I needed to change this, this, and this. And she did it in such a gentle way. It wasn't a reprimand. It was advice from a wonderful sister who was like a mother. And every time I sing Gentle Woman, I think of Mary Fran. Never assuming, just very gentle. But she got her message across. She did. Thank you, Mary Fran.
Johanna. Mary Fran was always very, very interested in my work at the Healing Place. She asked me about it, who was there, what we did. And one time she said, "Do you think I could go there?" And I said, "Sure, certainly you could," not knowing how, but we'll do it. And she and Kathleen von der Haar came down, and they spent hours with the women, went through some of their sessions, and then sat in the parlor with them, talking casually. And she was very moved, very, very touched by their stories, and they opened up to her. And at one point, she did this to me. I was sitting across the room from her, and she said, "Come here." And I went over to her and I bent over her, and she said, "Do you think we could open a healing place?" And I said, "We'll talk about it." And we did talk about it. Obviously, it never came to be, but she was always extremely interested in what I was doing there, and all the way up to the very end, asked me about it, was interested in what I was doing and everything that was going on there. So I truly appreciated her prayers and her support.
Well, I think there's so many. When you look at what Eleanor prepared for the board about Mary Fran, and you look at all the different kinds of jobs that she took, all the different positions, you know, from the great theologian teaching people to going around with Hart Schaffner marked suits, showing people various places where we lived, what we might be looking like, you know, later when we went into contemporary, and just an amazing number of things. Personally, I'm sorry that we don't have a picture of Mary Fran looking at us. Her eyes are away and not looking out at us. She had the most wonderful eyes, and they twinkled at times, you know. She had this wonderful little sense of humor that would come and always of the kind of openness and affection, but it was the way she would look at you, and then, you know, there'd be a little twinkle begin, and she's remembering something that you experienced together or something like that. But it always brought you closer to her, no matter what. Even when we go by where Gabe and Mary Fran were in their wheelchairs here, she'd always look up, you know, so glad to see people, and, you know, want to greet them, want to greet them. And that's just the way she was, all the way, you know, to the end. And so, but you know, when you look at the list of things that she was asked to do, like from, you know, introducing the novices and blah, 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 to Gethsemane and to some of the great people that were there, and she worked with that. But then there were these other jobs, traveling into Illinois. One was telling me that she came to talk about the suits, the Art Schaffner Mark suits that we were going to be wearing, and just whatever it was. But you look at that list that's there on the board now, that lists all the different kinds of jobs that Mary Fran took on for Loretto, for all of us. So, and anyway, a great woman. And we were all lucky to have her with us.
Nicole, I think we're finished here at the Mother House.
Okay, thank you. If anyone on Zoom wishes to share, please click on the microphone icon to unmute yourself and then begin speaking. If you try to speak at the same and someone else is doing so at the same time, please try again when that person has finished. Thank you. Go, Mary Catherine, did you want to go?
Yes, I'll go. Thank you, Nicole. This is Mary Catherine Rabbit. I met Mary Fran when my postulant class entered at the Mother House in the fall of 1964, and Mary Fran had just been elected to the General Council. And she didn't teach us that year. She taught us Christology the next year, and that's the reason I went into theology and got 2 degrees in theology, because of her in that class. But at the end of our postulant year, Virginia Williams, the intrepid director of our postulant program, decided that we should go on an overnight camping trip before we went into retreat for our vows. So we're cleaning the swimming pool, getting it ready for the summer, and Virginia says, "Oh, you all, we can use this pool cover as the floor of our sleeping place." So we trudged out to Little Ireland, all 25 of us or whatever. We each had our bed rolls. That's all we could take, our blanket and our pillow and a sheet. And Virginia was with us, but Mary Fran was the only professed sister that came with us on that overnight expedition. And we had a great fire. We sang, we roasted marshmallows, we had hot dogs, all of that good stuff. So that, seeing her as a person was really very special. And then the next year she taught us Christology. But I want to tell 2 stories because people have been so serious. I want to tell 2 fun stories, okay? One is that when Mary Fran was asked to take the habit, the Hart, Schaffner, and Mark's suit around, this shows you what the order of importance was in the congregation. I was a junior at Webster, majoring in theology, and I was asked to teach the novices theology in her place while she traveled with the suit all around the country. And I think I got the better end of the deal, to tell you the truth. And the other funny story is I lived for many years with Kath O'Malley, and they lived Mary Fran and Kath lived together at St. Mary's for a number of years. And Mary Fran delighted to telling me the story. She said, Kath corrupted me and I loved it.
This is Sue Kenny. I am one of the novices that Mary Fran spoke about in a day, however, that was not the traditional life of a Loretto novice. And we lived with Mary Fran and the council, just three of us in the building in the novitiate with the council. I think that what I want to say is to talk about love. I think we are blessed with great loves in Loretto. And I, for me and for us, I think Mary Fran is a great love, just a great love. I think she would easily say the words that we saw in the Psalm, you have put into my heart a marvelous love. That could be Mary Fran saying that. So of course, in these days since Mary Fran's death, it has caused me again to review my life in Loretto, which has Mary Fran as a thread throughout that entire Loretto life. And I was an extension volunteer in Pueblo and was invited to go over to the Loretto house to view those famous suit options. Kathleen Vonderhaar will remember that evening. I won't go on. And then I can say that I really learned theology through the wisdom of Mary Fran and Carol Stolmuller, who she would arrange for us to have lunch with, James Douglas, and others. There were picnics in the woods with Rose Alma, and we would go to what we used to call the waterfall in the woods. Mary Fran and I prepared Christmas liturgy for a few years at Loretto Heights College when the Loretto community was still large enough and wanted to invite the other Denver community, but to have a liturgy of our own. And then I saw her bloom and blossom again in Santa Fe. I was amazed when I went there to celebrate her Jubilee and saw the amount of people now that also, like what we're saying here, really wanted to honor Mary Fran, who she just met in those recent years. And then lastly, she offered the gift of her dying moments to Leanne Detheridge, who sat all night as we would have wanted to sit, reading from a book of Mary Fran's called My Life of Grace. So from Mary Fran, I learned something about acting justly and loving with tenderness and walking with God. I'm a lifetime of gratitude. Thank you.
Well, this is the 1-2 punch because, well, first of all, I just want to say what precious moments these are that we share, reviewing the lives of our beloved sisters and our own personal experiences of them. It is such a gift, and I feel so blessed to be able to do that. So, you know, I honestly believe that Mary Fran's greatest jewel in her crown was spending the canonical year of Sue Kenny, Anna Coop, and Barbara Anderson with them at the mother house. And I mean, she was not a woman who was going to hammer some outmoded form onto us. No, no. When we got there, she said, what would you like to learn? And kind of, how would you like to grow? What experiences would you like to have? And we shared some of those, some of them kind of jokingly, but at any rate, we did share them. And then we proceeded into a year of just extraordinary experience. Mary Fran was so open and so willing to hear from us. She didn't mean she didn't have her own ideas. She did. And she would share them with us. And sometimes we'd say, wow, that sounds great. And other times we'd say, no thanks. And she would accept both of those answers. She was a fantastic teacher for me to learn from postgraduate work about theologies that were so new. I mean, I was totally Thomas Aquinas in my day. And so a whole new world opened up under her teaching and her sharing. She was fun. She was really fun. I think that Sue and I could put on a pretty good hour-long show just telling the stories of that year, and it would be you know, a comic show because they were wonderfully funny times, and not that there weren't any challenges, there were, but beloved times. And at the end of that year, every one of the three of us loved Mary Fran deeply and still do. And I would have to say myself that I know that in years past, some people could hardly wait to move on from the mother house and their canonical years. Well, I myself was a malingerer. I liked it so much and felt that under both Mary Fran's guidance and her following, she really expressed that she learned from us as well. And it wasn't what I thought a canonical year would be, but I would say it was one of the most growth-filled years of my life. And so I really chalk that up to Mary Fran, and we have been good friends ever since that experience, and she has always been incredibly supportive and interested in my life as I have been in her phenomenal life. So God bless Mary Fran.
So I'd like to this is Buffy Bozen in El Paso, and I had many wonderful experiences with Mary Fran, but I think one of the many things that was wonderful is Mary Fran loved her family of origin, her siblings, her nieces, her nephews. I felt like I knew so many of you who are on this screen, and I know you know that you were loved, but we know too how much her family meant to her and how much each and every one of you helped her live her life to the fullest. So thank you, Lotta's family, nieces, nephews, for sharing Mary Fran with us.
This is Kathy Muller in Denver. I first met Mary Fran, canonical year, Kentucky, and she taught theology, but the part she also taught was the documents from Vatican II. And I feel like she opened up for us a new understanding of what it is to be ecclesial people, what it is to be part of the people of God, which has certainly changed my life. We lived together several different places, quite a few years. I can tell you a lot of those stories. But when I think about the essence of Mary Fran, I've thought about this a lot in the past, but especially in the last few days. The word I think of is gratitude. Mary Fran, throughout her life, and especially as she moved back to the mother house, always talked about gratitude, that her life was abundant. Just, she had hard times, she had good times. We experienced a lot of those together. But her phrase is, I am so grateful for what my life has been, my life in Loretto, my life in my family, all of the ways that this incredible mystery, divine mystery of God has dwelt in me. And I'm so aware in the last few years, when she no longer when I would visit, she wouldn't recognize me or, would not necessarily speak, but the gratitude continued to come from her. That sense of my life has been filled with love, and I continue to offer that to you, whether I know who you are or not. And so I just think of someone who not only knew that in her heart, but knew that in her soul and could just live that. So Mary Fran has been a very significant person in my life, and I've loved her well, and will continue to rely on her wisdom in my life.
This is Lydia Pena. The morning of July 31st, when I learned that Mary Fran had died quietly, I must have had a smile on my face. In 2007, when I left employment at Regis, I chose to leave on July 31st, the feast of Saint Ignatius of Loyola. So soon after leaving, I decided to make a 1-month Ignatian retreat. And I asked Mary Fran if she could direct it. She was happy to do so. We arranged it, and we're both looking forward to it. When I arrived, she greeted me. A joyful greeting, as people have expressed. And she shared that she had recently developed sounds in her head and would not be able to make my retreat or to direct it. You can imagine my disappointment, both about the sounds in her head and about the fact that she would not be directing my retreat. So insofar as I know, those sounds that began 13 years ago never left her. So I thank you, Mary Fran, for who you were. Even though you were not able to direct my retreat, you modeled, as so many have said, how to live. So va con Dios, mi hermana. Well done, good and faithful servant.
This is Mary Nell Gage in Denver. And I was one of first 3, then 2, then only me as a novice under Sister Mary Frances at the Mother House. And our routine was going into Louisville for Mary Fran to teach at Bellarmine and myself to take classes. And then afterwards, sometimes we would visit Broadway, and sometimes we only did our Uber McKesson duty, which was picking up the medicines to bring to the Mother House. One of my most memorable events that was, at least 4 or 5 or 8 nights a week was when the bats on 2nd floor were swooping from one end of the hall to the other. And at first, when we were 3 novices, we each had brooms. But when I was the last one, then it was Mary Fran and myself with the brooms chasing the bats. After the Mother House, Mary Fran came to Vietnam when Susan Carroll and I were there. She came on an escort ticket on Pan Am. She could come for no charge, but then the return was caring for babies on that long flight from Saigon back to the US. And so there are so many connections that she and I have shared. Bats and babies being 2 of them. And I just want to say what I think is in many of our hearts. I dreaded the day that she would fly away from this earth.
Can I speak?
Yeah.
I'm Mary McDonald Morrison, Mary Fran's niece. She's my godmother, and I'm so glad you mentioned Vietnam and the babies, because I mean, in our family, she opened so many pathways to her nieces, especially, and to her nephews. And for me, her embodiment of social justice and ways to manifest it were often not what you would call scholarly, in the sense that, well, I mean, related to being a scholar, but a deep, profound person of social justice. So Vietnam and bringing those babies back, I just have to tell you that my uncles were like, you're going to Vietnam to bring babies back? And then she came to Washington and stayed with us, with Luke and some of the other sisters, to get arrested for Vietnam and had to be bailed out of jail. And then I'm remembering when she was walking with women and refugees coming through Mexico, maybe. You will remember all of this. But she opened pathways for all of us to be more, maybe, than what we started out as. So she was filled with spirit and mentored all of us. And speaking of spirit, I just have to say, she did like old fashions. And I am going to toast her, remembering wonderful family times with her, my father's old fashions, and also the old fashions that we shared in the community room in the novitiate, where we would sit in the living room talking and singing into the night. she was just beloved. And, you know, listening to all of you, and especially the family coming from Moberly and the connection with Loretto, from that, she was part of you from the cradle to the grave. And you have lost a beloved. And when families lose a beloved, people should say, I'm so sorry for your loss. And I feel that for you, because this is a huge loss for your community. And I would like to hug you, but I can't do that right now. So I just want to say I love you. And I know you're sad. Me too. And that's it. Thank you.
I'd like to, I can't tell whether I'm on or not, but.
You're on, Martha.
Okay, thank you. I don't go back as far as the people who've spoken before with Mary Fran, but I do go back as far as the beginning of my co-membership, because she was the person who was in charge of co-membership at the time that Nisa Shoto and I were interested in joining. And we had a little bit longer, what shall we say, acquaintance time, because we hadn't been part of the community. And I remember very well Mary Fran saying, we take our co-members very seriously. And I remembered that and repeated it to other co-members because that was so important. But another thing that I want to comment on was that Mary Fran was one of a mentor of many of us in the new cosmology. She was really into that. She and Jane Marie were giving workshops and talks on it, and she was one of the first that really awakened me to a new way of looking at earth and spirit. So she was very dear, and I resonate with many, many of the things that most of you were saying, but I won't go on and on.
Hello. Can I go ahead, or is someone else going to talk?
Go ahead, Mary Helen, and then I think Vicki will go after.
Thanks, Nicole. Well, I too knew Mary Fran in the novitiate in my canonical year. She taught theology. So we had to do a paper. And I thought being a math major, doing papers was a little struggle for me anyway. But this was really a struggle. I thought, oh dear, you know, what on earth am I ever going to do this paper on? So I went to Mary Fran and I said, sister, I said, I really just do not know what to do this paper on. And I said, I don't have any ideas at all. And she said, well, how about if you would do it on how much understanding of the fact that Jesus was divine did Jesus have during his life? And I thought, well, now, of course he knew, you know, all the time that he was divine. I mean, what would this be about? But I didn't say that out loud. So I said, okay. And so I proceeded to do a lot of research. And it was just this wonderful learning for me that I would never have had without her putting, you know, this idea in my head. And, you know, I read all kinds of different theologians and their opinions about it. And my whole understanding of the gospel changed because of that. You know, that when Jesus was 12 and in the temple, he didn't know. I mean, my opinion is, based on the research that I did, that he didn't have any idea that he was divine. But he was, this 12-year-old person who was really interested in all of those kinds of things. So anyway, that made a huge impact on me. And then I have a funny story to tell about Mary Fran. That took place at the same time when I was in the novitiate. And I was, on Saturdays, I would go and teach religion to little kids, and they were second graders. And they were really misbehaved. I mean, they were kind of crazy, all over the place. And so I mentioned that to Mary Fran, and she said, what you have to do, and you know how she had those piercing eyes, you really have to look at them. Just stop what you're doing and just look at that little person, and you'll find a real difference. Well, believe me, I did everything I could to really look at those little ones, and it didn't seem to make much difference. And so I told Mary Fran about it, and she said, you just keep at it. So for a couple weeks I did, and finally she said, do you want me to come and teach those kids? And I said, would you? And she said, I would. So she came and taught the kids. And so I just was off to the side, thinking, oh boy, this is going to be the lesson of my life. I'm going to learn so much. Well, on the way home, she said, well, Sister Mary Helen, I don't think I did any better than you. And she really didn't. In fact, it was maybe a little bit worse because the kids had gotten to know me. So, after those several weeks, she said, really, she said, second graders. And she said, and I could not get them to behave. She said, now this was really amazing. She said, this is a total first for me. But I always chuckle about that. And, she was just so humble about it, straightforward, but with those, those piercing eyes that, it felt like she could just see everything with those eyes. But anyway, those are a couple of stories I have, and I am so grateful for her and knowing her in my life. I always thought she was just absolutely a wonder.
Hi, this is Vicki. Hello.
You can hear, you're coming through, Vicki.
Oh, all right. I was one of the folks who was at the House of Studies when Mary Fran and Antoinette were there. And those were really wonderful years for me. And then as a year, over the years, there were several times when Mary Fran and I reunited with each other and served in a couple committees. But the story I want to share is what I remembered this afternoon. And it was it was a year after I had my 25th anniversary. And at that time, Pat Williams, who was a year older than I, we did a lot of sharing of our own, what was going on for each of us. And so, and basically, I think what probably what we would call it now is midlife crisis, but we didn't call it that at the time. Anyway, so one day Mary Fran was coming to visit in El Paso, so Pat and I made arrangements to have lunch with her. And so we were rattling on and on about what we thought we're looking for and carrying on. And finally we said, would you be willing to lead a workshop or a retreat for those of us who are midlifing? To which she burst out laughing and she said, "Oh, I'm so relieved because I thought the two of you were telling us you wanted to leave the congregation." So anyway, I have only tender memories of Mary Fran, and I so appreciated what her niece said. Yes, I remember all the fun, but what I'm very conscious of is how my soul is hurting because Mary Fran's not here anymore. Thank you.
I'm Jane Costers, and when I first started on the staff with Loretto in 2001, and I accompanied one of the sisters to the mother house, transitioning there to live there. I never really knew when I got there who to check in with. It sort of, sometimes it turned out to be, especially if they were in the infirmary. And I always had kind of a hard time knowing, well, I wonder who's in charge. And I always stayed at the novitiate. And I just got to have Mary Fran became sort of the person I would check in with after I brought someone to the mother house. And she would just listen to she would ask me, well, who did you bring? And you're right, she was a very good listener. And I would be able to tell her how the trip went. And then it always seemed like she was the most wonderful, kind, interested contact that I had whenever I came to the mother house. And she always made me feel so welcome. And it sort of calmed my flounderingness of, what do I really do now? Because I was the only one that was sort of in charge of what I was doing. I just loved Mary Fran for her helping me be welcome and stable, and she's just been a wonderful mentor for me, and how to listen and how to be kind. And she's really made a big difference in my life, and I'm going to miss her an awful lot.
I think that's it, Mother House.
We give you glory, thanks, and praise. Yeah.
We give you glory, thanks, and praise. Oh, bless our works and guide our ways. Glory, 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 glory. We give you glory, thanks, and praise. Amen.